Thomas Blake had seen all kinds of signs posted on his land over the years, but none quite like the shiny yellow one zip tied to his fence post. HOA visual violation, cited. The words looked like they'd been printed with a little too much enthusiasm, bold, underlined, and accompanied by the tidy Willow Run HOA logo in the top corner. He leaned in, squinting through his wireframe glasses as the morning light filtered through the pecan trees. The paper fluttered in the breeze like it belonged to another world, one that didn't understand tractors, dirt roads, or why silos needed to be tall. He folded the Gazette across his lap and set down his coffee, black as the morning before sunrise, still steaming in the crisp late October air. His porch swing creaked gently as he stood. The porch thermometer read 51 degrees, though it felt colder when the wind passed through the gaps in his flannel. Across the field, the sun was rising slow and orange, backlighting the silhouette of Willow Run's neat white fences and identical rooftops. They'd only gone up 5 years ago. Before that, the land had been just another pasture on the edge of Fort Worth. Thomas walked the gravel path past his barn and stopped at the fence. The sign didn't make him angry. Not yet. He ran a hand along the worn top rail and traced the knot where his father had once hammered in a guide nail. His breath rose in front of him. He gave the sign a gentle tug, then pulled out his pocketknife and clipped the zip tie in one clean motion. The paper folded crisply in his hand. "Mr. Blake." The voice came from just beyond the cedar hedge that separated his property from Willow Run's community trail. Karen Langley stood there, arms folded, clipboard tucked tight against her chest like a shield. She wore a crisp cream blouse, slacks that didn't belong near a gravel path, and a lanyard with her name in bold, Margaret Langley, HOA president. "Mornin', Miss Langley," he said, tucking the citation into his jacket. "That's HOA property you just tampered with." "This post's on my land," he replied mildly, tapping his boot on the packed dirt. "Least it was last time the county surveyor walked it. Fence hasn't moved since '84. Karen stepped forward, just enough to rest her manicured nails on the top rail. "The board has received multiple complaints regarding the grain silos visible from our community. They're disruptive to the visual serenity we're trying to maintain." Thomas adjusted his cap. "Ma'am, those silos feed a base full of soldiers. I reckon serenity's less important than keeping their food stores running. That land's leased to the state. Every row you see past this post is part of a supply contract." Karen raised a brow, smiling tightly. "We've decided that visual impact qualifies as nuisance under our charter. The HOA reserves the right to flag environmental discordances that affect neighborhood appeal." Thomas considered that a moment. Never heard corn called discordant before. Karen's smile twitched. "We'll be following up in writing. I trust you'll take this seriously." "I always take breakfast seriously," Thomas said, glancing back toward the porch. "That's where I was headed before I saw your sign." He gave the fence a light tap, nodded, and turned to walk back, the gravel crunching in calm, deliberate steps behind him. Later that afternoon, after refilling the feeders and finishing a slow lap around the irrigation lines, Thomas found Steve Delgado sitting on the tailgate of his truck. Steve had the kind of face that always looked like it was about to smile. He raised a thermos in greeting. "She leave you a gift?" Steve asked, nodding toward the folded yellow notice in Thomas's hand. "Shiny as a penny. Got a clipboard to match." Steve chuckled. "I've got 4 of those stacked in my garage. She passed them out at last week's HOA meeting. Said she was initiating a new visual order." Thomas handed over a tin of apple butter he'd made the weekend before. "And I suppose you voted for her?" "Didn't have to. She ran unopposed." Steve took a sip from the thermos. "Now she's talking about running for city council. Wants to prove she can revitalize underzoned edges. That's you, by the way." "I'd guessed." They sat in companionable silence for a moment. A delivery truck rumbled past on the county road. Steve tossed a pebble across the gravel. "She asked about your contract. Wondered if you actually had one." "I've got 3 copies, one in a fireproof box. Fort Worth Army Base doesn't skip paperwork." Steve nodded. "Just keep an eye on her. She's not just making noise. She's looking for headlines." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the silos, Thomas read the HOA bylaws online for the first time in a decade. Most of it was boilerplate, noise ordinances, trash bin schedules, rules about shrub heights. But none of it applied to land outside the perimeter. His land. That night, he fell asleep with a fresh pot of coffee brewing for the early shift. Morning came with cold dew and a mailbox full of flyers. Thomas walked to the field gate to start the generator, but paused when he saw it. Another sign. This one was heavier, laminated, and hanging by a short steel chain looped around the gate's top bar. It clanked lightly in the wind. The same yellow print stared back at him. Access under temporary review. Do not enter. He stood there for a while, longer than before. The old gate hadn't been locked in 40 years, and now someone had dared to call it theirs. Thomas reached for his phone, not to call anyone, but to take a picture. Then, slowly, he folded the sign in half, slid it under his arm, and turned toward the house. Something had changed. Something quiet, but certain. The gate to Thomas's field had never been locked by anyone but him, until the morning he found a brand new HOA padlock clicking in the breeze. It was polished chrome, still gleaming in the dew, dangling from the latch like it had something to prove. The old gate, with its rusted hinges and decades of faithful squeaks, had seen storms, tractors, and even a high school prank involving inflatable cows, but never this. Thomas stood still, his thermos tucked under one arm, and gave the lock a gentle nudge. It tapped against the steel bar with a hollow clink. Just beneath it, laminated and zip tied to the chain link, was a sheet that read, "Do not enter, property under review, Willow Run HOA Safety Committee." The field behind him stretched wide and gold, freshly turned rows catching the slanting morning light. Beyond the road, over the privacy shrubs and trimmed hedges of Willow Run, sprinklers were ticking rhythmically in front yards. A jogger passed by with earbuds in, oblivious. Another day in suburban Texas. Thomas pulled out a small leather notebook from his jacket, flipped to a blank page, and wrote 3 things in his steady block script. Date: November 1st. Time: 6:43 a.m. Status: gate locked with unauthorized HOA padlock. He clicked his pen closed and tucked it back into the spine. His breath hung briefly in the air. Calm, measured, no swearing, no calls just yet. The sound of a truck in the distance brought his eyes toward the bend. Right on time. The Army logistics vehicle, a matte green box truck with federal plates, was making its way down the access road. The driver slowed when he saw Thomas by the gate. The truck pulled up just short of the entrance, air brakes hissing. A young man in uniform leaned out the window. "Morning, sir. I've got your delivery, frozen goods and dry staples." Thomas tipped his hat. "Appreciate it, but I reckon you won't be unloading through this gate today." The driver frowned. "Something wrong?" Thomas pointed to the lock. "Seems the homeowners association decided they needed to protect the community from vegetables." The driver squinted at the laminated sign, then raised both brows. "Want me to call it in?" "Not yet. Let's start local." Thomas pulled out his flip phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. The line picked up on the second ring. "Waller." "Mornin', deputy," Thomas said. "You busy?" "Not too bad. Just broke up a noise complaint involving 2 leaf blowers and 1 very dramatic Pomeranian." "Sounds about right. I've got a situation over at the East Gate. Someone's locked me out with a shiny new padlock and left a notice that says I'm under HOA review." There was a pause. Then, "Your land's not in their zone." "That's what I thought. I'm 10 minutes out." Thomas hung up, then turned back to the driver. "Mind holding tight for a bit? If you've got paperwork, jot down that delivery was blocked. Make sure someone sees it." The driver nodded. "Will do." He scrawled a few lines on a clipboard and climbed back into the cab. Across the road, Steve was already outside, holding a garden hose over a patch of impatiens that probably didn't need watering. He gave Thomas a look, a subtle, wary glance beneath bushy eyebrows that said he'd seen it all before but still couldn't believe it. Thomas nodded once in return. That's when Karen arrived. She came marching down the community trail like a flag in human form, bright blazer, oversized sunglasses, clipboard under her arm. Her heels clicked on the walkway even though it was gravel. Behind her trailed a curious couple and a teenage girl with a leash but no dog. "Mr. Blake," she called before she even reached the gate. "You're trespassing on the visual domain of Willow Run." Thomas stayed where he was. "Ma'am, I'm standing on state leased ground." Karen gestured broadly. "This gate faces the community. It creates an unsafe atmosphere for our children. Just yesterday, one of them said the equipment in the field looked like a tank. Thomas let the silence hang for a second too long. It's a combine. It's intimidating, she insisted. We're trying to foster a sense of safety and order. You can't just have industrial machinery sitting visible to our walkers. Steve adjusted the hose to the right, now spraying water onto the sidewalk. Karen continued, so we've taken the liberty of installing a temporary lock while the board reviews your structures. Thomas said nothing. He only reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again, not to call, but to take a photograph. One of the lock, another of the sign, and finally one with Karen, mid-sentence, pointing toward the field. You're not going to remove it? She asked, clearly startled. No, ma'am, he said evenly. Not yet. Karen's face twisted into a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. You'll be hearing from our legal committee. There's an HOA hearing next Thursday. I suggest you attend. He nodded, then turned back toward the road where the army truck idled, engine humming patiently. You might hear from someone else first. At precisely 10:12 a.m., the army driver taped a note to the outside of the gate and departed. Thomas watched the truck disappear over the rise, then stepped forward to read the message. Delivery blocked. Federal supply route obstructed. Will report. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into the same notebook from earlier. Across the street, Karen stood beside her porch with a thermos in one hand and a self-satisfied smile on her lips. She watched him like a hawk, only not for danger, but for triumph. Let him call the sheriff, she said, chuckling. I have bylaws. The call came just before sunrise. Thomas's phone buzzed once, and a voice said, Mr. Blake, this is Fort Worth Base Logistics. We have a problem. He was already halfway through his second cup of coffee, the porch radio whispering grain prices and weekend forecasts behind him. The house was still, save for the hum of the old fridge and the occasional creak of settling lumber. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number, local area code. Not spam, not social. This is Blake, he answered. Major Ellison. I'm the liaison for outbound agricultural operations at Fort Worth Base. A delivery yesterday was blocked. Driver flagged a field gate locked by a third party. That's correct. You mind telling me what's going on out there? Not at all, Thomas said, calm and clipped. I've got records ready. Lease agreement, route maps, signed transport schedules. Just say when. There was a pause on the line. Mind if I come by this morning? Coffee'll be hot. By the time the sun crested over the silos, Thomas had cleared his desk, papers sorted into neat stacks, the field map unrolled and weighted at the corners with small stones. The radio stayed on low, murmuring about frost lines in Denton County. Everything was ready. He even laid out a second mug. Major Ellison arrived at 8:02 a.m. in a government SUV, his posture straight even in the early light. Tall, clean-shaven, and just enough gray at the temples to suggest both experience and patience. He stepped out, took in the field with a quick scan, and nodded once before shaking Thomas's hand. Nice spread, the major said. Serves the job, Thomas replied, leading him inside. You take cream? Straight. They settled in the front office, the smell of pecan smoke from the wood stove warming the air. Thomas handed over a file folder thick with lease documents, delivery logs, and a printed photograph of the locked gate. Filed copies of everything 6 weeks ago, he said. Didn't expect I'd need to use them. But I like being prepared. The major flipped through the paperwork. You've got your ducks in a row, Mr. Blake. 63 years teaches you to stack them early. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry corn stalks that stood tall in their final weeks. When they finished reviewing the paperwork, Thomas walked the major out to the gate, the very one that had been padlocked. It was open now, but the chain still hung from the post, slack and scuffed. Ellison stepped to the edge of the drive and studied the line where HOA property gave way to state-leased land. This access road is listed in your lease as essential under Emergency Agricultural Logistics Code. That's correct. We've got trucks depending on this route. Food supply for over 3,000 personnel. Thomas said nothing, only nodded once. I'll handle it, the major said. We'll be issuing a formal notice to whoever placed that lock. Across the hedgerow, in the neatly trimmed enclave of Willow Run, the HOA clubhouse buzzed with activity. Karen stood near the podium inside, mid-sentence to a half-circle of folding chairs. Her voice rang with cheerfully feigned humility. "We're not against farming," she was saying. "We just believe in community standards. No one wants to see hulking machinery while walking their golden retrievers." There was polite laughter. Someone in the back nodded, unsure if they agreed or just wanted the meeting to end on time. Karen held up a photograph, a low-angle shot of Thomas's combine from last week. "We can't be bullied by rural disarray. That field is chaos waiting to happen." Steve Delgado, seated by the snack table, tilted his phone just enough to capture a bit of video as Karen added, "He's lucky I haven't fenced the whole thing off yet." Later that afternoon, Thomas was back in his workshop, oiling the hinges of a storage locker, when his phone buzzed with a message from Steve. Subject: HOA memo, internal only. Attachment: PDF. He opened it. The memo was brief but pointed, from Karen's email. She referred to the field as a hazard zone, and questioned why the county allows unregulated mechanical operations near families. It was dressed in legal euphemism, but the intent was clear. Thomas printed a copy and placed it in the same folder he'd given the Major. At 4:17 p.m., an email left the inbox of Major Ellison addressed to the Willow Run HOA Board. Unauthorized interference with federal agricultural operations. CC. State Agriculture Department, County Zoning Commission. The letter outlined the route designation, the federal lease, and the legal implications of blocking access to a military supply line. It was measured but unmistakably firm. Karen received it the next morning, delivered via certified courier. She opened it on her porch, still in robe and slippers. The envelope was thick, official, her name typed in all caps across the top. She scanned the first line aloud, lips parting into a tight smile that quickly dissolved. "You are hereby notified?" Her face tightened. The breeze lifted a corner of the page, but she didn't move to stop it. Karen had always imagined herself shaking hands with state officials, but not like this, not with two of them standing in her driveway asking questions she couldn't answer. The morning sun was soft over Willow Run, the air cool but pleasant, the kind of day she typically reserved for ribbon cuttings or community strolls. But today, instead of a camera crew or a grateful crowd, there stood two state agents, one holding a clipboard, the other holding silence. Inspector Shelby was trim, plainly dressed in a windbreaker bearing the seal of the State Agricultural Department. He flipped a page with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades investigating people who thought rules only applied to other folks. Beside him stood Lieutenant Avery, quiet and stone-faced in a pressed logistics uniform, his boots not collecting a speck of Karen's meticulously swept driveway dust. "Mrs. Langley," Shelby began, scanning the paper. "You stated last week during a recorded meeting that Mr. Blake was, quote, lucky I haven't fenced the whole thing off yet. Is that accurate?" Karen blinked. "That was a private community meeting. Community meetings are open forums under state access laws. And one of your board members submitted that clip to our office voluntarily." Karen's jaw flexed. She shifted her weight and offered a smile practiced 1,000 times over HOA brunches. "Our concern has always been safety. That machinery is quite large. It's visible from multiple backyards. It's unsettling for the children." Lieutenant Avery raised an eyebrow, barely perceptible but enough to turn the air sharp. Shelby didn't blink. "Visual impact is not a legal boundary, ma'am. You are aware the access road, signage, and gate in question fall entirely outside HOA jurisdiction?" Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "That field borders our community. We have visual domain. That means we have a say." "No," Shelby replied flatly, "it doesn't. Perception is not jurisdiction, ma'am." Thomas, from his place across the fence, could see the entire exchange. He leaned against a post, one hand resting on a cracked mug of Earl Grey, the other wrapped around a short-handled hammer. The fence rail he'd been repairing lay on the ground. He hadn't touched it since the state car pulled up. Now, with the sun climbing just a hair higher, he sipped his tea and waited. Earlier that morning, both officials had stopped by his property first. They walked the perimeter with him, verifying GPS coordinates, checking boundary markers, and photographing the leftover HOA padlock still dangling from the gate post. Thomas had given them a folder, neatly labeled and tabbed, including the memo Steve had forwarded and a screenshot of Karen's internal hazard zone email. They said little, only nodding from time to time, asking for clarification, noting timestamps and satellite overlays. Shelby had murmured, "Your documentation is thorough." Thomas had only nodded once in reply. Now, across the field, the HOA clubhouse buzzed. Inside, Karen had scheduled what she proudly called a community safety briefing. She stood before a projector screen with images of tall grass, machinery silhouettes, and some stock photo of a broken fence that definitely wasn't from Thomas's property. Half a dozen residents sipped coffee in folding chairs, murmuring confusion more than concern. Steve stood at the back, arms crossed, phone held just low enough to appear like he wasn't filming. The projector buzzed faintly as Karen clicked to a new slide titled Containment Options. She'd barely gotten through her talking points when the door opened. Shelby and Avery entered, quietly, without ceremony. Karen faltered mid-sentence, her smile freezing, the clicker in her hand forgotten. "We're here to discuss your recent interference with state-designated infrastructure," Shelby announced calmly. Karen tried to steer. "This is a private community event. It won't take long," Avery said, and even in those 4 words, the room dropped 5 degrees in temperature. Outside, Thomas leaned down and hammered the rail into place, each strike steady, rhythmic, like a drumbeat announcing change. That afternoon, as the clubhouse emptied, Karen found a thick envelope waiting at her doorstep. She recognized the state seal before she even bent to pick it up. A red stamp along the bottom read, "Official, cease and desist notification enclosed." Inside, the letter was clean and clinical. Her actions had breached the Agricultural Access Protection Act and triggered a federal logistics disruption. Any further interference, the notice warned, could result in civil penalties, or worse, criminal ones under certain clauses. She stood on her porch holding the letter like it was ticking. Meanwhile, across the neighborhood, Thomas wiped his hands on an old towel and made his way back to the house. On the porch sat a copy of the newest HOA newsletter, slipped under his side gate by Steve earlier that morning. The subject line, bold and underlined, read, "He's humiliating us, time to act." Karen didn't believe in coincidences, but the fact that the only access to her Veterans Day festival was through Thomas's road? That had to be sabotage. She stood in the HOA office, one manicured finger tapping the laminated festival layout as the committee gathered around the folding table strewn with vendor contracts and sponsorship flyers. The green lawn had been reserved, the flyers printed, and the inflatable Patriot-themed bounce house was en route. She'd even secured a local radio DJ who promised to spin classic Americana between speeches and cake cutting. But now there were emails. Requires access code. Permits must be filed through landowner. Clarify land classification. Private agricultural zone? Karen brushed them aside. "It's a community road," she declared, ignoring the fact that Thomas had filed a notice 2 weeks ago labeling Tractorway, a name that still made her grit her teeth, as a restricted agricultural use corridor for the duration of his fall harvest. He hadn't blocked it, he hadn't threatened anyone, he'd simply gone by the book, 1 page at a time, and sent the paperwork to the county clerk's office. The clerk, a calm woman named Rhonda who answered calls with "County Access and Zoning, how can I help you?" had forwarded Karen a copy of the notice along with a polite message. "Please coordinate with the landowner for any festival-related commercial vehicle access. As of November 9 to 12, entry requires site-specific approval." Karen deleted it. By Thursday, food trucks started calling. The kettle corn guy was the first. "Hi, this is Rick with Texas Twist. I'm told I need some kind of permit?" "Just show up," Karen told him. "It'll be fine. They'll wave you through." Another message came in from the bounce house vendor. Then the chili cook-off sponsor. By Friday morning, 3 had dropped out, citing uncertain access and logistical complications. Karen doubled down. She ordered more balloons. She added an extra pie judging category. She posed in front of the community flagpole with 2 elderly residents for a blurry Facebook post captioned, "Willow Run honors veterans. Join us Saturday." Across the field, Thomas stood in his barn, leaning over a ledger while his niece painted a wooden sign, "Harvest Welcome, live bluegrass, fresh cider, all ages." There was no email campaign, no laminated posters, just word of mouth and a few small signs near the county road. The smell of hay, warm cider, and split firewood drifted faintly through the open doors. Saturday morning arrived clear and brisk. The community green was strung with orange streamers and faded bunting. Karen, dressed in a red blazer and matching scarf, paced along the edge of the field. The radio booth was silent. A generator hummed beside a half-inflated bounce house, struggling in the cold air. Tables sat empty. Parents stood around awkwardly, clutching lukewarm coffee in paper cups. A kid kicked a deflated balloon across the grass. By 10 o'clock, only one food truck had arrived, and the driver refused to enter the road. "Lady," he said, holding up a map. "This says I need a signed permit. I'm not trespassing for a chili booth." Karen tried to reason. "We're a community festival. There's no threat. The landowner's just being difficult." He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. My insurance won't cover it." He drove off, tires crunching slowly down the gravel path. At 10:43 a.m., a committee member approached her, phone in hand. "I just got a text from a resident. They say the Blake farm has music playing. And a full parking lot." Karen froze. The wind shifted, carrying a faint echo of fiddle strings and laughter across the field. The smell of kettle corn, real kettle corn, followed. She turned slowly toward the fence line. There, just beyond the hedgerow, the Blake property was alive. Cars parked in neat rows along the side drive. A small fire crackled in a raised stone ring. Children ran across a hay maze set up between the barn and silo. A dog barked. Someone cheered. Back on the green, a balloon slipped loose from the streamer arch and drifted slowly into the pale blue sky. Karen stared at it as it rose, bright, weightless, and completely out of reach. They came for the hayrides, stayed for the pulled pork sandwiches, and left talking about the man who didn't say much, but never backed down. By early afternoon, the Blake farm had transformed into something that felt like memory. Rows of hay bales framed the field. Smoke curled gently from fire pits dug into barrels, and the strings of white lights stretched from the barn rafters to the fence posts like stars caught in a net. The fiddler was already into his second set, bow flying across strings with a rhythm that pulled laughter from kids and foot taps from the old-timers sitting near the cider barrels. Families had started trickling in by 10, first a few from the edge of town, then some from Willow Run, neighbors who'd just come to look. Most didn't leave. They brought their folding chairs, their kids, their dogs. They chatted quietly at first, as if unsure they were allowed to be there. But then someone handed them a slice of warm cornbread, and someone else showed them where the marshmallows were skewered and waiting. Steve was manning the cider table near the entrance, grinning as he poured. "Last batch is the spiced one," he called to a group of teens lingering by the kettle corn station. "Best wait till your mom says yes." The local veterans had claimed a cluster of chairs beneath the big oak. They talked over styrofoam cups, trading stories about drills and deployments while leaning on canes and walkers. One of them reached out to pat the side of Thomas's old red tractor like it was a friend. Thomas himself moved quietly through the crowd, checking the hay ride loop, adjusting a fire pit log, making sure the fiddler had hot coffee. He wasn't loud. He didn't make speeches. He just made sure things worked. By 2 o'clock, the green lawn on the other side of the hedgerow was nearly silent. A few straggling decorations clung to their stakes. The bounce house had deflated sometime after noon and never re-inflated. The radio DJ had packed up early when no one came to spin the prize wheel. The one remaining food truck stood idling, its driver on his phone, waiting to be told whether to bother. Karen paced the center of the lawn like a campaign manager on a sinking ship. She watched the flow of foot traffic bypass her event entirely, rerouting around the end of the hedgerow to the gravel lane that led to Thomas's barn. The music from across the field drifted louder, clearer with every step. A little girl trailing her parents paused near the edge of the wall lot and turned to ask, "Why's there no bounce house here?" Her mother, without slowing, replied, "Because we came where people are welcome." Karen's fists clenched by her sides. She marched along the hedgerow and reached the spot where a narrow gate separated Willow Run from the field road. On the other side, a pair of off-duty deputies were coordinating parking. She raised her voice. "Excuse me. I need to speak with Mr. Blake. I'm the HOA president." One deputy approached with calm eyes and an even tone. "Ma'am, your name's on the restricted list. Mr. Blake's permitted to enforce private access today." Karen blinked. "Restricted list? That's absurd. I'm trying to maintain order." The deputy nodded. "Exactly." Across the field, someone struck up a fresh tune. The fiddler launched into the battle hymn of the Republic, and the veterans near the oak tree stood, slowly, reverently. They didn't salute, but they sang the first verse with quiet pride. The lyrics carried across the corn rows and hung in the chilly afternoon like mist warmed by meaning. Children roasted marshmallows over hickory flames, twirling sticks like magic wands. A teenage boy led a Shetland pony in circles while toddlers giggled from the saddle. The cider flowed, the brisket vanished, and someone pulled Thomas aside just long enough to hand him a foil-covered dish. "Peach cobbler," the woman said, her voice soft with appreciation. "You earned it." Thomas smiled. "That's kind of you." "Kind nothing," she replied, patting his arm. "This neighborhood's been waiting for someone to remind us we're allowed to stand up." He thanked her, then returned to stacking extra kindling beside the fire pits. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky a pale orange that matched the pumpkins lining the fence rail. Back at the house, after the crowds had thinned and the music had faded into gentle conversation, Thomas stepped onto his porch to check the mailbox. Mixed in with a stack of circulars and utility envelopes was a plain white notice from the county zoning office. He slid a finger under the flap and read the heading. Emergency Appeal for Easement Reclassification, filed by Karen Langley, Willow Run, HOA President. He read it twice. Then he folded it neatly, slid it back into its envelope, and stepped back into the warmth of his home, the scent of cider and oak smoke still clinging to his jacket like victory whispered in autumn air. Karen always believed every problem could be solved with a clipboard, a meeting, and the right signature. But now the gate didn't recognize her authority, or her SUV. She sat behind the wheel of her Lexus, engine idling, staring at the keypad mounted beside the newly installed black metal gate at the start of Blake Veterans Way. A layer of frost glazed the edges of her windshield. Her gloved finger hovered over the keypad as if sheer indignation might will the numbers to change. Nothing happened. The gate, quiet and unyielding, didn't budge. Across the road, the fields lay still under a blanket of early December cold. Morning fog hovered low, curling around the base of the wooden sign that read, "Blake Veterans Way, private agricultural access only." Below it, a small plaque added, "By county designation, November 2023. Karen's breath fogged the glass as she leaned back. She hadn't signed the access agreement. Every other board member had. Steve, now acting HOA president, had even offered to help her fill it out. But she refused. On principle, she said. The county zoning officer had been clear during the hearing. The easement has been converted into a named agricultural road, maintained by Mr. Blake under the conditions of state support logistics. This road is not public right-of-way, she'd stated, voice neutral, professional. But I use that road every day. Karen had snapped. The officer had nodded politely. And now you may request authorized access, if you recognize its private designation. Karen hadn't. And so, as the gate's silent sentinel stood firm, she was left with only one option, the detour. 20 minutes of gravel road, potholes, a low creek crossing, and the disgruntled silence of her own company. HOA residents had adjusted easily. Each received their gate code via mail in a polite letter from Thomas Blake's office, along with a map of county-approved detour routes and a note that read, "Let me know if you need assistance." TB. But not Karen. She'd refused every step. And now, she sat alone, watching a neighbor's SUV roll past and tap in a code before the gate swung open gracefully. A wave, a nod, then gone. Back at the HOA office, Steve placed a notice on the bulletin board. Reminder. All packages now addressed to Blake Veterans Way must list the new USPS-approved address for delivery. Karen's lips had drawn tight when she first saw it. She'd gone to the post office the next morning, only to be told her zip code had updated. That she could fill out a complaint form, if she liked, but it wouldn't change anything. That afternoon, she filed another appeal with the zoning office. This one was stamped, received, then, denied. The attached letter was brief. Road status is final. No further action recommended. She tried calling the county clerk. Left 2 voicemails. Silence. On Saturday, she drove to retrieve a parcel, something she'd ordered weeks ago. She arrived at the gate again, no code. This time, she parked, stepped out, and marched to the small parcel box near the keypad. Next to it stood a bright red mailbox, hand-welded into the shape of a miniature tractor. Wheels, a smokestack, even a tiny flag that popped up when mail was inside. Karen stared at it like it had insulted her personally. A mother and child walked past from the other direction. The boy pointed. "Look, it's the tractor mailbox. That's so cool." Karen didn't move. The gate remained closed behind her. Across the way, Thomas sat on his porch swing with a mug of warm cider in hand. The wind carried the smell of cedar and cinnamon from the wreath hanging on his door. He watched her calmly, not smug, just still. The gate clicked softly behind Karen as the next vehicle rolled through, another neighbor passing, another wave. Later that week, a new sign appeared in front of Karen's house. Plain, white, quiet, for sale, private showings by appointment only. There was no open house, no flyers, no balloon festooned sign, just the subtle tilt of change. On a cold Tuesday evening, just after dusk, Thomas sat once again on his porch. The fields beyond were bare now, the harvest finished, the barn cleaned and ready for winter. A pair of headlights cut across the corner of the subdivision as a black SUV rolled down the gravel detour for the last time. It slowed near the gate, paused, then turned west, away from the fields, away from Blake Veterans Way. Thomas sipped his cider, warm against the frost, and watched the taillights fade into the night. The moving truck came just before sunrise. Karen didn't wave, didn't honk, didn't glance back. The gate opened for the movers, but not for her. She idled in her SUV behind them, waiting for the cycle to complete. Her eyes were fixed ahead, unmoving. When the gate rolled open again, it did so without greeting, without permission. It was mechanical now, coded, controlled, and not a single digit of that code belonged to her. As her vehicle disappeared down the county road, the exhaust trailed behind like a whisper of something that used to matter. By mid-morning, the neighborhood had already shifted. Gone were the clipped murmurs at mailbox clusters, the tight smiles over lawn edging. In their place came a slow, warm rhythm of life returning, simple, unhurried. Children raced along the gravel path near the fence, kicking up little clouds of dust. The last of the orange leaves clung to branches overhead, and Thomas's field, though mostly harvested, still carried the golden afterglow of autumn's work. The tractor sat parked beneath its lean-to, washed and waxed. Someone had tied a red ribbon around its grill. Steve stood near the clubhouse, checking off names on a list as neighbors set up tables. The potluck was his idea, something spontaneous and neighborly. A big folding sign rested near the sidewalk. "Thanks for sticking around, Willow Run Harvest Potluck," in bright blue paint, complete with little handprints from the neighborhood kids. Thomas arrived with 2 tins, one of kettle corn, still warm from his stovetop, and the other of homemade cobbler, the crust gently cracked to reveal peach and cinnamon underneath. A young mother gasped as he walked up. "You brought that cobbler again? My husband's been dreaming about it since the festival." "Figured I owed him a second round," Thomas said with a modest nod, setting the dish down on the dessert table already sagging under pies and casseroles. Someone called his name from the cider booth, and soon he was caught in a carousel of small conversations. It wasn't fanfare, but it was something deeper, recognition, appreciation. An elderly woman in a quilted jacket clutched his hand as she passed. "We didn't know how good this place could feel without all the rules," she said. "Now it feels like home again." Children darted between tables, faces sticky from caramel apples. A girl in a denim jacket pointed toward the end of the road. "Look," she told her little brother. "That's where the tractor mailbox lives." The boy squinted, then smiled. "It's got a smokestack and everything." Near the cider barrel, a tall man stepped forward, gray hair cropped close, a windbreaker hiding military insignia, but not entirely. He held something wrapped in a cloth bundle. When he reached Thomas, he unfolded it gently to reveal a neatly folded American flag. "You didn't just protect your land," the man said, voice steady. "You honored all of us." Thomas took the flag with both hands. For a moment, neither man said a word. Then he nodded, deeply, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. The sun slipped low in the sky, casting long golden lines across the winter-ready rows of soil. The fire pits crackled softly, logs glowing as laughter echoed across the lawn. A few residents stayed behind to help clean, but most filtered home as the evening settled in. Steve gave Thomas a wave from across the tables. "See you next season," he said. "And I mean that. President's not going anywhere." "Well," Thomas said, "let's just keep the potluck part." Later, As twilight draped its quiet arms across the town, Thomas walked the fence line with a tin mug of coffee in one hand and the folded flag tucked carefully under his arm. The breeze stirred the dry husks at the field's edge, making them rustle like soft applause. Behind him, the porch lights of Willow Run glowed warmer than they ever had. He stopped at the gate, just for a second, and looked out at the road beyond, now bearing his name. Children had traced Blake Veterans Way in sidewalk chalk nearby, each letter proud and imperfect. He watched the chalk glint under the porch light, faint but still there. And as the last sunflower bent toward the winter sky, Thomas tipped his hat to the gate, just in case she looked back. When the last truck rolled away and the gate clicked shut behind it, peace settled gently over the fields and fences of Willow Run. What began as a quiet man defending his land became a quiet victory for a whole neighborhood. Proof that dignity doesn't shout, it stands. Rules can build fences or bridges, but only when held by the right hands do they truly protect. Like a lantern in a winter window, steady resolve can light the way for others to follow. Perhaps it's never too late to stand firm, speak softly, and help your community find its way home.